Welcome to Lecture 4.3, World War II, the Pacific Theater. Now, we saw previously how Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, resulting in a declaration of war by the American Congress against Japan, then followed by a declaration of war by Germany and Italy against America. For a time in late 1941 and early to mid-1942, Japan does run wild in the Pacific. They conquered Hong Kong, Guam, and Wake Island within days of the Pearl Harbor attack. Japanese forces struck from Indochina into Thailand and British Malaya. They soon advanced into Burma. The British stronghold of Singapore fell in February of 1942. After the quickly assembled American, British, Dutch fleet loss in the Battle of Java Sea on February 27, 1942, the Dutch East Indies fell in March of 1942. The biggest setback for the Americans in the Pacific, though, was the fall of the Philippines. From December 1941 to May of 1942, the Japanese attacked the Philippines by air and landed troops on its islands. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered by FDR to evacuate the Philippines, and he did so in March 1942, vowing, "I will return." MacArthur set up bases in Australia. He left behind American and Filipino forces on the island. They tried to hold out against Japan. There were Japanese attacks, and then there was finally a siege against the American and Filipino forces. But in May of 1942, the last of those forces surrendered, and the brutal Bataan Death March soon followed. The Japanese marched their American and Filipino POWs, some 70,000 men. They marched them 80 miles to a hastily built camp. Along the way, the Japanese bayoneted stragglers, withheld food and water from the soldiers, the POWs, and inflicted other sorts of cruelties on them. Some 10,000 of these marchers died, mostly Filipinos, but some Americans. Now, the Japanese may have conquered Australia during this period as well, but they were defeated in the Six-Day Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. This battle made naval history by the fact that it was a naval battle in which the ships did not even see each other, much less fire upon each other. The entire battle was fought by planes taking off from aircraft carriers. So the Japanese planes would take off and go search for the American Navy. The American planes would take off and go search for the Japanese Navy. The Americans did lose an aircraft carrier, the Lexington, but the Battle of the Coral Sea stopped the Japanese invasion of Australia. After their initial 6 months of running wild, the Japanese had to decide whether to continue into Southeast Asia or to try to finish the job begun at Pearl Harbor, knocking the Americans out of the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto wanted a decisive battle, and he favored attacking the American installation at Midway. This would force the Americans out of the Pacific entirely. It was thought if the American fleet was forced back to the West Coast, the vastness of the Pacific Ocean would prevent an invasion of Japan, so Japan would be safe. The Japanese were debating different options about where to invade when the Doolittle raid took place in April of 1942 and settled the debate for them. So on April 18, 1942, a group of B-25 bombers took off from the USS Hornet. That was an aircraft carrier. They took off some 650 miles away from Tokyo. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle. The B-25s bombed Tokyo and a handful of other Japanese cities, inflicting immense psychological but little real damage on Japan. The planes then crash-landed in China and the Soviet Union. 3 captured pilots were executed by the Japanese, and 1 captured pilot later died in prison. After the raid, the Japanese decided that because the home islands were vulnerable, they must attack Midway and rid the Pacific of the American Navy. So the Battle of Midway took place on June 4th, 1942. Before the battle, the Americans knew an attack was coming, but they didn't know where. They had broken some of the Japanese military code in an endeavor known as magic. They knew that an attack was coming at the place labeled AF in the Japanese code. Commander Joseph Rochefort, in charge of a team at Pearl Harbor trying to break the code, he had a hunch that AF referred to Midway, so he planned a trick. He ordered Midway to send out a false report that they were running short of fresh water. Soon after this, the Japanese reported through their code that AF was out of water. Rochefort's gamble had paid off. As a huge Japanese naval force of nearly 200 ships sailed to Midway, the Americans, commanded by Admiral Chester Nimitz, prepared a trap. He reinforced Midway with planes, troops, and anti-aircraft barriers. He ordered the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to come to Pearl Harbor so they could take part in the coming battle. In the ensuing battle, Midway was attacked by the Japanese, but in a stroke of luck, American Dauntless dive bombers came upon the Japanese aircraft carriers just as they were rearming and refueling their planes on the deck of the ship. And when the Zeros, who were supposed to protect the aircraft carriers, they were too low to defend them. The dive bombers sunk 4 of the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers. The Americans only lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown. The Americans turned another would-be Pearl Harbor-like attack back on the Japanese. With Midway, the Japanese hope for a short war vanished. It marked the farthest reaches of the Japanese offensive in the Pacific. From this point on, the overstretched Japanese Pacific Empire would be pushed back by the Americans. Midway also served kind of as the battle that ushered in the age of the aircraft carrier. Now, another important outcome of the Battle of Midway, there was a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands by Japan. And in that diversionary attack, a Japanese Zero fighter crash-landed, but it crashed mostly intact. The Americans used it to reverse engineer a plane, and they built the F-6F Hellcat as a response. The Hellcat would climb faster and higher. It flew and dove more swiftly. It maneuvered more agilely and carried a heavier armament than the Zero. So because of this crash, the Americans ended up creating a better plane than what the Japanese had. After Midway, the strategic thinking of Japan and America shifted. Japan was now on the strategic defensive and America was on the strategic offensive. The Americans launched an offensive in the Solomon Islands. The first great land battle between the Americans and Japanese in the Pacific was the Battle of Guadalcanal. This took place from August of 1942 to February of 1943. There were many land and naval battles during the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese ended up losing 22,000 killed or wounded or missing, and the Marines lost about 1,000 men. David M. Kennedy writes that the main lesson of Guadalcanal was, quote, that given time and a fair opportunity, the weight of growing American manpower and munitions inevitably crushed the steadily wasting Japanese reserves of men and material. Guadalcanal also served as an introduction to the severity of fighting in the Pacific. One Marine on Guadalcanal said, I wish we were fighting against Germans. They are human beings like us, but the Japanese are like animals. The Japanese were indoctrinated with the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was an ancient samurai philosophy that taught loyalty, austerity, self-denial, and indifference to pain. Loyalty is heavier than a mountain, and our life is lighter than a feather. The Japanese were taught to never surrender because surrender brought shame on a person. So when Americans or other enemies of the Japanese surrendered, this code often caused the Japanese to look down on them as less than human. 1/3 of American POWs held by the Japanese died in the war, but only 1% of American POWs held by Germans died during the war. Now, the American strategic offensive in the Pacific ultimately was a joint effort between the Army and the Navy. Admiral Nimitz was in command of the entire Pacific, but General Douglas MacArthur would advance up New Guinea and then liberate the Philippines, finally advancing to Formosa and the China coast, while Admiral William Halsey would advance up the small island chains, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Carolines, and the Marianas towards Formosa and the Chinese coast. Then there would be the attack on the Japanese home islands. Eventually, America in the Pacific would pursue an island hopping or leapfrogging strategy. To avoid this strategy, avoided Japanese strongholds when possible by just jumping over them and then leaving the Japanese garrison to wither on the vine, as it was stated. Now, eventually, Japanese successes against Chiang Kai-shek in China would make Formosa and China useless as a base of attack against the Japanese home islands. But the advent of the B-29 superfortress would allow the Americans to attack the Japanese home islands from the Marianas in the Pacific. In late 1943 and early 1944, the Americans conquered the Marshall Islands. In June 1944, they began their campaign against the Marianas. By this point, the Americans had refined their tactics for amphibious landings. They coordinated air and naval guns for tactical troop support and stormed the beaches as part of an amphibious blitzkrieg that extended far inland. In June and July 1944, American forces landed on Saipan. The Japanese garrison there was 32,000 strong. At one point, 3,000 Japanese made a desperate banzai charge. Nearly all of them were killed. Thousands of Japanese citizens also committed suicide on Saipan. Some of them jumped off cliffs onto rocks. Some of them walked into the ocean and drowned themselves. Some of them blew themselves up with hand grenades. Total casualties on Saipan were the 32,000 Japanese strong garrison, and then thousands of civilians. So pretty much all the Japanese are wiped out. The Americans had suffered some 14,000 casualties with 3,400 killed. I have a video here that kind of shows the suicides on Saipan, and some of this is kind of graphic.
He tells me you wouldn't believe it unless you saw it. There were hundreds of Jap civilians, men, women, children, jumping off the cliffs to their deaths. At the edge of the 200-foot cliffs on Marpy Point, I look down and I see bodies.
The war correspondent Robert Sherrod wrote in Time magazine, "What did all this self-destruction mean? Did it mean that the Japanese on Saipan believed their own propaganda, which told them that Americans are beasts and would murder them all? Do the suicides of Saipan mean that the whole Japanese race will choose death before surrender?" A lot of people started thinking that the events on Saipan further reinforced the idea that the last battle for Japan would be a very bloody one. Also in June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea occurred. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because they shot down more than 300 Japanese planes while losing fewer than 30 American planes. Overall, in this multi-day battle, the Japanese lost some 480 planes and 3 aircraft carriers. News of the loss of Saipan brought down Hideki Tojo's government in Japan, but another general was put in his place, and the Japanese government was still in the hands of the Japanese military. The next battle to take place was for the Philippines. The Japanese received their oil from the Dutch East Indies through the Philippines, so they had to defend it against an American invasion. That invasion came on October 20th, 1944. In a carefully arranged ritual, MacArthur landed on the island of Leyte to lead the liberation of the Philippines. I got a video clip here of that to show you. In an effort to defeat the American invasion, the Japanese sent 3 naval formations to challenge the landings at Leyte Gulf. What occurred next was the largest naval battle in the history of the world. Over a 3-day period, 282 ships, 200,000 sailors and airmen fought it out in a battlefield that was 100,000 square miles. The 2 biggest battleships in the world, the Yamato and Musashi, were present. The Japanese also employed a new and fearsome weapon against the Americans, the suicidal kamikaze attack. Kamikaze just means divine wind, and it is a reference to a typhoon that scattered Kublai Khan's invasion fleet headed for Japan in the 13th century. Each flyer was presented with a 1,000-stitch belt. That was a strip of cloth into which 1,000 Japanese women had each sewn a stitch, kind of symbolically uniting themselves with the pilot's ultimate sacrifice. And I've got a clip here of some kamikaze attacks.
Navy films of land-based Jap planes attempting to silence U.S. fleet bombardment of Okinawa in late April. A Jap plane in a low-level attack. F-6F returns to its carrier. Another F-6F makes a forced landing in the water. A damaged plane coming in for a landing gets out of control. After the pilot is safely removed, the fire is extinguished. Our Akak barrage brackets a Jap plane and knocks it down.
In the end, Japan lost at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 9 cruisers, a dozen destroyers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of sailors and pilots. MacArthur secured the island of Leyte by December 1944. Next, he invaded the island of Luzon. This is where the Battle of Manila took place from February to March of 1945. It was a vicious street-by-street battle in which 100,000 Filipino citizens and thousands of American soldiers died. Now, by the end of March 1945, the Philippines were secure. The next two major battles in the Pacific would include some of the most savage and desperate fighting of the war, the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Battle of Iwo Jima took place first. It occurred from February to March of 1945. 21,000 Japanese defended the island. The Americans landed in February 1945. When the fighting ended in March, only a few hundred of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers survived. Over 6,000 Marines had been killed and another 17,000 wounded. It was on Iwo Jima that one of the most famous photographs from World War II was taken. Joe Rosenthal's picture of the Marines raising the American flag over Mount Suribachi. There was another photographer there, Lewis Lowry. He had taken the first picture of the flag raising, but then the incident was replayed and the Rosenthal picture is the one everybody recognizes. After Iwo Jima came the Battle of Okinawa. This took place from April to June of 1945. On this island, there were over 77,000 Japanese, 180,000 Americans, and 1,400 ships took part in the invasion. The Japanese allowed the Americans to land unopposed on this island. The goal was not to prevent the landing, but to try to suck in as many Americans as possible to kill. Then, after the landings on the beach, the full fury of the Japanese was felt. The Japanese also launched furious kamikaze attacks that sank 36 American ships, damaged 368 others, and killed almost 5,000 sailors and wounded another 5,000. So these kamikaze attacks off of Okinawa, these were way more deadly than the Pearl Harbor attack that got America into the war. It was on Okinawa that another banzai charge took place. This time it was composed of some 6,000 Japanese who charged the Americans with sidearms and knives. Japanese Colonel Yahura recorded that, quote, all vanished like the morning dew, so the Japanese banzai charge, they're just wiped out. When the battle officially ended on June 22nd, 1945, only some 7,000 of the original 77,000 Japanese remained alive. Over 100,000 Okinawan civilians had been killed. The Americans suffered 7,613 killed or missing, 31,807 wounded, and 26,000 non-battle casualties. This is in addition to the 10,000 killed and wounded at sea in the kamikaze attacks. So basically, it looks like Japan is going to fight to the last man when the time comes to invade the home islands. President Truman became president following FDR's death in April of 1945. He met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on June 18th to discover the landing Kyushu scheduled for November. They talked about this landing. Truman and the military commanders were convinced that hundreds of thousands of American casualties would be the result of the invasion of Japan. Later in July 1945, President Truman went to Europe for the Potsdam Conference. This is in a suburb outside of Berlin. It was here that he received word of the successful test of the first atomic bomb that happened on July 16th. On July 24th, Truman told Stalin that the Americans had a new weapon that might end the war in the Pacific. Now, Stalin didn't seem surprised, and he simply said that he was glad to hear about this new weapon and that he hoped the Americans would make good use of it. Stalin had spies in America, and they knew about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. So he knew about the bomb before Truman knew about the bomb. Truman was kept in the dark about the Manhattan Project while he was a senator and vice president. It was only after becoming president that he learned about it. Now, towards the end of the Potsdam Conference, something called the Potsdam Proclamation was made. It called for the unconditional surrender of all the Japanese armed forces, and it warned that, quote, the alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. Now, Truman decided that the bomb would be used. He wrote later in his memoirs, quote, let there be no mistake about it. I regard the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used. And if you think back to the time, this bomb had been developed to end the war. You know, maybe use it on Germany, but Germany's out of the war at this point, so now use it against Japan. Japan had already faced extensive bombing. In January 1945, Air Force General Curtis LeMay arrived in Guam to take command of the 21st Bomber Command. He had once said about war, I'll tell you what war is about. You've got to kill people, and when you've killed enough, they stop fighting. LeMay had two new weapons at his disposal to help him kill the Japanese, the M69 projectile and the B-29 Super Fortress. The M69 was an incendiary bomb that spewed burning gasoline that stuck to its targets. The B-29 Superfortress was designed by the Boeing Corporation, and they were the best bombers that America had. They were nearly 100 feet long with a wingspan of 141 feet. The tail section was 3 stories tall. The B-29s carried a crew of 11 and could hold 20,000 pounds worth of bombs. It had a combat range of more than 4,000 miles and could operate at over 35,000 feet. Now, on March 9th, 1945, LeMay launched 334 of these B-29s towards Tokyo from the Marianas. They dropped their cluster of M69s over Tokyo. They crisscrossed Tokyo and created a firestorm. The thermal currents rose over a mile up in the air, and they would actually knock the B-29s around. The firebombing of Tokyo that March killed 90,000 Japanese civilians and left 1 million homeless. So this is just one night of incendiary bombing. 90,000 are killed. The firestorm was so intense that many Japanese boiled to death in the canals and the ponds when they tried to escape. Over the next 5 months, LeMay's bombers attacked 66 of Japan's largest cities. These attacks killed 900,000 Japanese civilians. They injured 1.3 million, and they left over 8 million homeless. So most people think the atomic bombs were the worst thing that happened to Japan. The atomic bombs didn't kill near as many people as these previous months of bombing, just regular conventional bombing. Now to contrast with this, the worst Japanese bombing of the American mainland occurred in May of 1945. The Japanese had launched about 9,300 incendiary balloons towards the United States. On May 5th of 1945, the Reverend Archie Mitchell and his wife Elsie, they were conducting a Sunday school near Bly, Oregon. Elsie and 5 children, they found one of these incendiary balloons in the forest. They tugged at it, they didn't know what it was, and it blew up and it instantly killed them. So these 6 deaths were the only mainland American casualties during the war. So just think about that. While American workers, many of them women, were building the B-29 Superfortresses that would kill over 1 million Japanese civilians and wounding 1 million more in some of the most horrendous bombings of the war, while that was going on, Japanese technicians, including school children, were putting together incendiary balloons that would float to America and kill 6 people. So that just shows you how the industrial might of the two nations was totally different, and it was really impossible for Japan to win the war. Now, despite the terrible prices paid on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the civilian casualties from the conventional bombings of the Japanese home islands, Japan refused to surrender. Harry Truman told them, "You need to surrender, otherwise we will utterly destroy you," and there was no response. The invasion of the Japanese home islands was scheduled to begin in November of 1945. It was thought that these invasions would cost 1 million American casualties. President Truman, a lot of the people at the time, the thinking kind of went, if we don't drop the atomic bomb and it costs us 1 million American casualties, and then, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years later, they find out that we had a secret bomb that could have ended the war and saved 1 million Americans, they would have, impeached the president, they would have arrested him, who knows what they would have done to him. So President Truman authorizes the dropping of the atomic bomb on the towns of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th, the Enola Gay dropped its bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, the plane Boxcar dropped its bomb on Nagasaki. The blast at Hiroshima killed 40,000 instantly, and another 100,000 were dead within a few days. The blast at Nagasaki killed another 70,000 people. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war against Japan. So because of these events, the bombings, the atomic bombings, and then the entrance of the Soviet Union into the war, the Japanese finally knew that the war was over. Emperor Hirohito, he recorded a radio address to the nation, which was played on August 15th, and he declared that Japan was surrendering. On September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese officially surrendered to the Americans aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Here's some footage of that surrender.
Battleship Missouri, 53,000-ton flagship of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, becomes the scene of an unforgettable ceremony marking the complete and formal surrender of Japan. In the Bay of Tokyo itself, the United States destroyer Buchanan comes alongside, bringing representatives of the Allied powers to witness the final capitulation. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander for the occupation of Japan, boards the Missouri. Fleet Admiral Nimitz, Pacific Fleet Commander, and Admiral Halsey welcome MacArthur and his Chief of Staff, General Sutherland, aboard. Admiral Nimitz escorts General MacArthur to the Missouri's veranda deck, where the 20-minute ceremony is to take place. It is Sunday, September 2nd, 1945. Cameramen and reporters of many countries record this historic moment as United Nations military leaders crowd aboard the Missouri and examine souvenir cards bearing the Japanese flag, special mementos of the occasion. And now, in a Navy launch, the Japanese surrender party arrives. They are headed by Agent Mamoru Shigemitsu, Foreign Minister of the Japanese Surrender Cabinet, who was wounded by a Korean patriot in Shanghai years ago and walks on an artificial leg. The Japanese delegation lines up on the opposite side of the surrender table from the Allies. A war which had entered its 8th terrible year in China, which had raged for 3 years and 9 months for America and Britain, which was the brutal, costly eastern half of the most horrible worldwide war in human history, is now within minutes of ending for good. General MacArthur speaks.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Mr. Shigemitsu comes to the surrender table. These dramatic first pictures were made by newsreel war correspondents and Army and Navy cameramen and were specially flown back from Tokyo. The time is 9:05 a.m. The Japanese have been on board exactly 10 minutes. General Yoshijiro Umetsu of the Imperial General Staff signs for the Japanese Army. The surrender documents by which Japan agrees to lay down arms completely and to obey all Allied orders issued by General MacArthur were printed by the Army on rare parchment found in a basement in ravaged Manila. General MacArthur signs as Supreme Allied Commander. The first pen used is presented to General Wainwright of Corregidor. The second pen to British General Percival, commander at the surrender of Singapore. MacArthur uses 6 pens in all, affixing what will be the most important signature in Japan to the document that ends permanently that nation's regime of terror and aggression. For the forces of the United States itself, Admiral Chester Nimitz signs. Behind Nimitz are the 3rd Fleet's Admiral Halsey and Admiral Sherman, famed amphibious commander. General Su Young Chang, Chief of Military Operations for the Chinese National Council, signs for China. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, commander of the British Pacific Fleet for the United Kingdom. Lieutenant General Kumza Nikolaevich Derevyanko for Soviet Russia. General Sir Thomas Blamey for Australia. Colonel Lawrence Moore Cosgrave for Canada. General Jacques Leclerc, hero of Africa and Paris, for France. Admiral C.E.L. Helfrich for the Netherlands. Air Vice Marshal L.M. Issett for New Zealand. Concluding the brief history-making ceremony, General MacArthur expresses a wish.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
Swarms of United States aircraft fly in formation overhead as the ceremony ends. The final United Nations victory has been won. The war is over. Peace is here.
Okay, so kind of how do we conclude, what do we conclude about World War II? Many Americans saw World War II as the good war. It was not a preemptive war, but it was rather a war that was started by America's enemies and then finished by America. It was fought by a united American people. It was a victorious war, one in which American representative government defeated the totalitarian states of Germany, Japan, and Italy. In all, 405,399 American soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen died in World War II. World War II changed America in many ways. The authority of the federal government grew exponentially during the war, and it remained very powerful after. Federal laws, rules, and practices put in place during the war, universal taxation of incomes, anti-discrimination employment standards, a huge military establishment, multi-million-dollar budgets, all of these things became kind of a permanent way of American life. America would emerge as a superpower because of World War II. David M. Kennedy writes, quote, "Americans commanded fully half of the entire planet's manufacturing capacity and generated more than half of the world's electricity. America owned 2/3 of the world's gold stocks and half of all its monetary reserves. The United States produced 2 times the petroleum than the rest of the world combined. It had the world's largest merchant fleet, a near monopoly on the emerging growth industries of aerospace and electronics, and for a season at least, an absolute monopoly on the disquieting new technology of atomic power. America also became an active participant in the international politics and diplomacy of the era. The powerful American state that had been a product of a hot war, World War II, would stay in place to fight a new war, the Cold War. There would not be a retreat to isolationism as had happened after World War I. America would now commit itself to being at least partially a policeman of the world and protector of free peoples everywhere.